So don't worry that the audience is mostly on indigenous peoples and conservation.
Oh, it's echoing.
You have to one of the laptops.
Okay, Johanna, can you help me in promoting attendees into panels?
Okay. Should I mute?
Yeah, mute yours, and then your voice can be picked up here.
Ah, I see.
Okay.
Hello. I find it. All right. Okay. Let me first welcome all our participants to this important conversation on doing it right, Indigenous peoples and biodiversity conservation. I am Joanne Carling, an Indigenous activist working with the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, IPRI, and we have co-organized this event together with TERO, with the IIFB, or the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and the CHRISTENSEN Fund, as well as DOCIP, the Center for Documentation on Indigenous Peoples. So these are the organizations involved in this event. We want to make this more conversation and an intimate discussion on the issue of Indigenous peoples and biodiversity conservation. Probably a lot of people are wondering why the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International is suddenly working on this issue and participating now in the CBD process, which we haven't, well, we're relatively new anyway. But the reason why conservation became a big issue for the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International is because of the dimension of criminalization of Indigenous peoples. That with the restrictive laws on Indigenous people's livelihoods and the absence of the legal recognition of our land rights, thousands of Indigenous peoples that are doing our conservation, sustainable resource management systems are ending up in jail or paying high penalties. So with this observation, we did a study at the country level in several countries, where it really came out that it's really a huge problem for a lot of communities. And now that the biodiversity discussion is aiming to conserve 30%, that's actually a welcome development. That finally there's some strong commitment from states to conserve the remaining biodiversity. The challenge, though, is that how will this be undertaken? And that is the kind of conversation that we need to have. If we have this common, I think it's a common agenda of states and Indigenous peoples, how are we going to conserve the remaining biodiversity so that we have something for the future generation, so that we can sustain the only planet that we live. And that is the conversation that we need to have, including in this, the CBD and beyond, and even in climate change and in other forums. How are we going to reach that target, that the real stewards of biodiversity will continue to survive and be able to sustain an intergenerational system of resource management? So with this as the background for this discussion, we actually have our panelists here. We have Stan Louis from the Torres Strait Regional Authority from Australia. He will actually be talking more of the partnership that they have in meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples and in conservation. And then we have Edward Porokwa, who is joining us online, but he sent his pre-recorded presentation because the internet connection in Tanzania is not good. So we wanted him to make sure that we we can listen to him with the alarming condition of a lot of the Maasai that are facing threats in the name of conservation area. And finally, and then we have also Jing, who's been very active in the negotiations here in the CBD, and together and along with other colleagues has really been championing the need for a rights-based approach to conservation. So she will also present what's happening now in the discussions here and what steps are needed in the next level, so that in the COP, hopefully we get good progress. And finally, we have Casey Box from the CHRISTENSEN Fund, who has been championing the support, direct support to Indigenous peoples in the framework of the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it's a unique position of a foundation to declare that we support the implementation of the UN Declaration, and we partner with Indigenous organizations and their allies in pushing the implementation of the UN Declaration at all levels. So in that context, they are also participating in broader, how do you say, pledges, if I may say, from other donors, supporting the conservation of efforts of Indigenous peoples, but grounded on the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. So these are our interesting panelists for this event. We will have a more conversational approach. So we will start with a good. I want to start with a discussion of a good way of working together in conserving on biodiversity conservation. So Stan, can you kindly take the floor and share your experience on this?
Yeah, let's start to turn your microphone on too.
Thank you for the introduction, and hello to everybody who's joining us today. I'm going to try and share share my screen. Host disabled participating screen sharing. Okay, so my name's Stan Louis. I'm from Torres Strait, which is the top part of the northernmost part of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. We have a lot of sea area in Torres Strait, so 40,000 square kilometres, which the government has recognised through our native title processes. That we went to the High Court, and the High Court decided in our favour to recognise our 40,000 square kilometres of sea country. So that then gives us responsibilities and ownership and decision-making around what happens in our sea country. I'm fortunate that I work for an organisation that supports traditional owners in Australia and provides funding and enables capacity building for those traditional owners. So I run quite a big land and sea management program in Torres Strait. I've 86 staff scattered across 14 inhabited islands. We have 146 islands, and of those, there are 14 that are inhabited. So in Torres Strait, we have 3 IPAs that have been declared in Torres Strait, and those IPAs make up 44% of Australia's national reserve system. The National Reserve Systems is a nationwide network of reserves set up to protect examples of Australia's unique landscape, flora and fauna for current and future generations. The 3 IPAs in Torres Strait are funded by the Australian government. They're managed by traditional owners with support of the Indigenous land and sea rangers, which are employed in my program. So those three IPAs are Pulu IPA, Ugulmalu Kawal IPA, and Thewarabarol Puramalal IPA. So, and those IPAs, there's one out to the west, there's one in the Central Islands, and there's one in the Eastern Central Islands as well. So just backtrack a little bit, I guess, in terms of those islands of Torres Strait Islanders firmly believe that Australia is the biggest island of the Torres Strait. So Ugulmalu Kawal IPA. So this is a really cultural and traditional significance. The English name is Deliverance Island, and it's significant to 5 of the Torres Strait Islander communities of Boigu, Duan, Saibai, Mabiog, and Bardu. So the traditional owners from the 5 communities have got together and created this IPA as a joint IPA. So the island is also internationally significant nesting site for flatback, green, and hawksbill turtles. We're doing some work there now, and we think it's a rookery for pelicans as well. And the island means, in the language name of the Western Islands, Murky Water Islands. And it's also the island that we believe has spiritual significance, because when we pass away, that's where our spirits go. Pulu Islet. So Pulu Islet is on Mabiog Island. And Mabiog Island is very significant in terms of their culture, because they still work through a cultural kinship system, which is called the COD. And they have a totemic skull cave still on that island. So the Gomolgol clan is revered across Torres Strait, and Mabuyag is the island language name for big voice. So, and it's also a site of Indigenous Australia's first known pottery tradition, with red slipped pottery made from Torres Strait clays dating back to 2,500 years old. Yep, okay, I'll try and share my screen now. That one there, I guess. Share. Okay. Okay, the Thewarabarol and Puramalal IPA is a series of 7 islands, and it's in the Central Island group. And this IPA was established in 2014 by the Kulkalgal people of Thewarabarol. And once again, this is an example where several communities have got together to create this IPA as a group of representatives. So with these IPAs, once the IPAs are declared, we also need to create plans of management. And those plans of management, you see 2 examples there. So those plans of management have activities in there, environmental activities, concerns. They have traditional visitation protocols. When we have meetings, code of conduct, all those sorts of good things that the Western approach to management contains. And it's something that's recognised through that Western governance kind of system. I guess some management activities. So obviously develop and implement a management plan. We have traditional visitation protocols in there that say you can't go on those islands without a traditional owner to take you there and to welcome you to those islands. We do beach cleanups and rubbish removal, biodiversity surveys, that's both land and sea, cultural site maintenance, We also do TK recordings of stories, songs, language. And I must say that our TK system also has a knowledge guardianship kit.
Yeah.
So the knowledge is guarded within those TK systems. And we also do invasive species eradication and monitoring. Some of the unexpected outcomes, I guess, in terms of people that are involved in these management plans and these IPAs is they've really got a good understanding now of good governance and procedural standards that you need when you're discussing issues of these IPAs. They've also learnt good reporting and record keeping, not only at the meeting minutes, but correspondence and things like that, so that we've got good records of those. They also good data analysis and modelling, so that scientific robustness. And we also now understand how these IPAs meet, government international obligations, and how we're actually meeting some of those obligations for the Australian government. And one of the good things that I've seen is my rangers have now got really good leadership potential because they're involved not only in on ground, but in terms of the management and in terms of governance. They're really proud of their IPAs, and now you can see how they carry themselves. It's a really, really good outcome that we weren't expecting at all. Yeah. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Stan. Just a follow-up. What do you think were the enabling elements of why you're able to have this kind of recognition, right? Because I think the two things that I mentioned, the ownership and decision making, was given to the communities, the traditional owners. So if we reflect on the issue of what would be different if this was not the case?
So one of the things that in Torres Strait, especially, one of the only real industries there is the fishing industry. So the commercial fishing industry, a very big commercial fishing industry. And our people were concerned about fishermen from outside of the region coming in and using some of these areas. And so that sort of sparked the conversation in terms of how, what is a process that we can latch onto that protects our areas. And from that process, we've now got all of those islands have had cultural heritage studies done. So which really recognize the cultural heritage of those, and obviously cultural heritage legislation is quite important. So, and then it was just conversations. The more work we did on country, the more they wanted to protect that country. So it's multi-use, but you have to be from there to go and visit there, or you have to get permission. And they'll give you permission to go there. They just want the respect. Give the respect, and they're happy to let you go and use that area. It's just that respect. It's just that two-way communication. And I think, we've come from a background, I guess, where there is lots of suspicion around Indigenous people. There's still some suspicion. But we want to make sure people understand, look, if you're going to come and visit our area, we're not headhunters anymore. We're not cannibals anymore. We're not going to, So we welcome you to our country.
So I think that's an important element, the respect. Because I think the problem in many countries is the opposite. It's given to tourists that do not respect. And that is also the part of the problem, right? So I think it's really important to hammer that the key principle that this kind of arrangements, the relations with Indigenous peoples in terms of our management, it should be based on respect as an enabling environment to have partnerships that really work for Indigenous peoples and the environment. So I'll get back to you later, if you don't mind, so that we can move on and continue the conversation. Also, maybe Edward later can also ask you a question. Can we have Edward Porokwa? He's not the video, if
Ngorongoro Conservation Area is a statutory established conservation area in 1959 following eviction of the Maasai from the Serengeti National Park in 1958. Ngorongoro is in the southern part of Serengeti, and the people were living in Ngorongoro and Serengeti National Park. In 1958, the colonial government made an agreement with Maasai traditional leaders that they will vacate Serengeti National Park and remain in Ngorongoro Conservation Area, and they will be there forever and they shall never be evicted, and that the colonial government promised that their rights and social services will be established to ensure their livelihood continue to exist. In the agreement, the colonial government also made it clear that should there be a conflict between the interest of the Maasai community and the interest of conservation and tourism, the interest of the Maasai community will take precedence. This resulted into formulation of the Ngorongoro Conservation Act, which has three main objectives. One, conservation; second, tourism; and the third one, protection of the right of the Maasai community. However, things have not been the same. In 1975, the colonial government evicted, the independent government evicted the Maasai from Ngorongoro Crater, which is a part of the Great Ngorongoro Conservation Areas. In 1979, the World Heritage Site designated Ngorongoro as a World Heritage Site. In 2008, the Ministry of Natural Resources of Tanzania banned cultivation in Ngorongoro, causing a lot of hunger to the members of the community. In 2016, the Prime Minister by then banned dry season grazing reserve in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, resulting into further poverty of the Maasai community in Ngorongoro. In 2019, Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority formulated the multiple land use model report, which in a great part affected the livelihood of indigenous people in Ngorongoro. The people in Ngorongoro have serious issues that affect their human right and livelihood. This include the government denying them having decent housing, decent accommodation, and decent ways of making their livelihood. They have not been engaged, although it was the objective of the colonial period, they have not been engaged in management of the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And this has resulted in serious poverty according to different statistics available. There have been reports of violation of human rights, and recently threats of eviction of the Maasai community in Ngorongoro. This has resulted from January 2020 with a serious intention of the government to evict the Maasai from their land, on the ground that there is an increased population of the people and there is an increased population of livestock in Ngorongoro Conservation Area. This has also resulted into many statements that have shown that the government is seriously intending to evict the people from Ngorongoro. In January 2022, there was a serious campaign by the government and the media that intended to show that Ngorongoro is being destroyed and the people have to go out because of the increased number and increased settlement and increased number of livestock. This has resulted into the issue being taken to the parliament, which again had very negative contributions to denial of the rights of the people. This included statements like using of bulldozers to remove the Maasai from their areas, using of the media to talk negatively about the Maasai culture, a big campaign that Ngorongoro does not belong to the Maasai alone, but it is for the public interest, and resulting into different a mission that was made by the government through the Prime Minister to the localities, trying to say that he's going to consult the people, which ended up on one-sided statements. People were not involved. There were threats to civil society. There were denial of right to discuss. There was denial to right to attend the meetings. And as a result, people started to protest. And even recently, there have been several meetings by the members of the community denying the allegations that are being given to them and saying that they are not ready to move where the government is planning to take them. One of the areas that they are planning to take them is Handeni and Simanjiro, where the people are not prepared and where there are a lot of conflict between the people in those localities and the community, the farmers who are doing their livelihood activities in the area. Currently, the situation is serious. There's a lot of follow-up to the media. The media is denied to report issues of the community. The civil society have been accused of instigating the community. And as we speak, 2 members of the community are interrogated in the police stations, and 2 civil society representatives are in the police station trying to give explanation. Their computers and phones have been confiscated, and the situation is such that the government is continuing to say that the violation, the people have to be moved. Further, all this is built on an argument that it is the demand of the UNESCO and IUCN that the people from Ngorongoro are being removed. The allegations that UNESCO and IUCN are denying, which they have not come publicly to say, that the government is telling lies about the reason for the eviction of the people in Ngorongoro Conservation Area.
Yeah, I was trying to check if Edward is online, and apparently he's not. There's probably a problem with the internet connection in Tanzania, but that's good that we had him pre-record his presentation. This case is the very classic case of a fortress conservation approach, right? And that is still continuing today and even getting worse. The last bit that he mentioned, that is one of the reasons why they think the government is pushing for the eviction is the strong recommendation made by the Heritage Committee on the need to depopulate the area because it's putting too much pressure to the wildlife. So there has to be a way to lessen the pressure to the wildlife and biodiversity. So that is sort of the level of the problem now. How do we address that, given that there's a growth in the population of the Maasai? But so what the Maasai leaders are saying is that they're not the ones putting pressure to the wildlife. It's the massive tourism, because they come in with their four-wheel drives going all over the place. And that is the one putting pressure to how the management is done. And of course, the tourism business is the one giving money to the government. And that is being overlooked. That's what the Maasai leaders are saying. Why are you blaming us and not stopping all these massive tourists, all these four-wheel drives going around and in the reserve area, and the Maasai are simply confined in a tiny space. So that is part of the problem now in relation to the issue of the Maasai. So that is just one side. The other side, the Lulyondo area, are also being there's also a threat of eviction from them because their wildlife area is going to be leased to the royal family of Dubai. So that's happening on the other side of Tanzania. So where will the Maasai people go with all these kind of threats to them, right? But it's also absurd to say that this area being conserved by the Maasai is just will be given to the royal family for their wild game. It's for the wild hunting game. So it's really a skewed way of the way that it's all about money, right? How will this wildlife giving money to the government? Unfortunately, that's how it looks like, and sacrificing the Maasai, not only the Maasai, but their practice, the way they have sustainably managed this wildlife. That's also why they continue up to this day. So that's the scenario that we're looking at now. So if you relate it with the target of the 30 by 30 biodiversity, how do we prevent this kind of fortress conservation driven by governments? In the context of not recognizing not only the rights but also the roles of indigenous peoples in conservation. So with that link, I now pass on to Jing to tell us what's happening now in the negotiations here. But before I pass on to Jing, I just want to acknowledge and sincerely appreciate the efforts, the collective efforts done by the IIFB. They're really consistently making sure that indigenous peoples' issues are visible and that the need for the rights-based approach to conservation should be given importance by states. So with that, Jing.
Thanks very much, Joanne. There you go. I don't know if I'm audible in this room. I am, obviously. I can hear myself.
Yeah, you are.
But can you please mute your...
Yeah, I'm muted.
Someone... Oh, it's this one.
At the volume.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, thank you. Technology, it's so difficult. Okay, okay, I'm well placed to make my comments now because we've heard of a positive case and we've heard of a negative case. But just bear with me, the in-person participants, because we have more than 50 virtual participants, and they're not necessarily following the negotiations here. So I wanted to start with the basics. Okay. So we're here in Geneva negotiating mainly, there are other items for negotiation, but mainly the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this is important because it's going to guide biodiversity action in the next 8 years. It was supposed to be 10 years, but now it's post-2020 and the next milestone is 2030. And this is important because it guides all of the parties to the CBD as to how they will implement legal policy and administrative measures in order to conserve biodiversity. The heart and soul of this post-2020 framework is the area-based conservation target. That's target 3. And this is something that indigenous peoples have really been engaging in because we want to make sure that the things that Edward's been talking about presented don't happen again, and to make sure that what Stan was telling us about could be the model going forward. Okay, so how have we been doing? Because this is not the first time that we have an area-based conservation target. In the current strategic plan for biodiversity of the CBD and their IPRI targets, there is target 11, which is the current area-based conservation target. Currently, that target doesn't contain any language on indigenous people's rights, despite the strong push in 2010 to include indigenous peoples. What they were able to offer is this word on equity. I don't know if I can share my screen. Okay, let me just share so that we have a better idea. Okay, so this is current target 11. And the way that the parties to the CBD agreed to address indigenous issues at the time was to introduce the word, the element of equity. Okay, This means that rights should be respected in implementing this area-based conservation target. There is also this new phrase here on other effective area-based conservation measures. And that was also the other element that was offered to address indigenous peoples' territories. Okay, unfortunately, it's taken 8 years. So since 2010, there was 8 years that passed before guidelines on exactly what OECMs are. Okay, and there are some concerns now that the guidelines are out. In addition to it being very late, there are some concerns about additional administrative burdens on indigenous peoples, which is not in accordance with the scientific findings. So scientists more and more have been releasing studies that show that indigenous peoples' territories harbor the most biodiversity. Now, this is true whether or not these territories are part of protected areas or whether they're outside of protected areas. And therefore, why do we require indigenous peoples to prove year after year that they are being effective in conserving biodiversity? Because that's what's currently required under the OECM's guidance. Okay, so what are we trying to do now in these negotiations? I won't go through the other slides, but I will go to so anyway, the short summary of these things is that equity has not been well implemented. The element of OECMs has really not been well implemented, which is why we have all of these examples of evictions because of fortress conservation. So this is in the DRC. This is the one that Edward presented, and on the right, that's the Kengkrachan Heritage Park in Thailand. And this is unfortunate because if you look at all the maps all over the world, there is huge overlap. And this is just the Amazon basin, but there's an overlap between protected areas and indigenous territories. Okay, and then we go to the positive examples from STAN, the indigenous protected areas on the right, and in Canada, indigenous protected and conserved areas. And the key element there is that their rights, the rights of indigenous peoples, are recognized there. That's why they were able to establish this new category of protected areas called IPAs and IPCAs. Okay, so that's, I don't think, is the Torres Strait included there? Excellent, yeah. So that's the map of all of the protected areas. And the only reason that that Australia was able to meet their area-based target is because of indigenous protected areas. So it's also an opportunity for the countries to meet their targets, no? Okay, so then you have this notion of ICCAs. Let's not go through these. Oh, I didn't have the language here. I'm sorry. I thought I had it here. But the language currently that's being proposed by indigenous peoples on Target 3. For one, recognition of governance, because this is what led us to preserve the biodiversity in our areas. The second is the need for FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent before protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measures can be established. And the third element is the acceptance that traditional practices by indigenous peoples lead to good biodiversity outcomes, and they should be recognized without any need of a declaration or any need of formal protection through the protected area system. So those are the three elements. We were able to present them on the floor last week. We got plenty of support. 37 countries at least expressed support for rights being there. And last night we got a copy of the non-paper, which is an interpretation of the co-leads of all of these interventions that they heard. And the good thing is that in paragraph 1 in Target 1, which is on spatial planning, we have their recognition of customary practices of indigenous peoples. So that's good. And on Target 3, which is the area-based conservation target, we have there in the last section, the language to give effect to the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Now, we had a long session this morning analyzing that text because it's certainly broader than recognition of indigenous, pre-prior informed consent of indigenous peoples. But there's also concerns around the language being a little bit imprecise. Okay, so we can accept that language actually because it talks about the rights of indigenous peoples. However, it's important to also have chapeau or guiding language that includes exactly what we mean. So when we say rights of indigenous peoples, it needs there needs to be free, prior, and informed consent. And when we say rights, it also means our right to establish our own protected areas, and for that to be recognized and counted towards target 3. So sorry if that was so technical. I tried to simplify it as much as possible, but that is the state of negotiations here, and we will be working within the next few days to really keep in the rights language in target 3 and in the guiding chapeau. Thank you.
Okay, thank Sorry, that was my this discussion of the non-paper, white paper, and chapeau, and brackets, and like, what are this? But that's how we learn when we engage in negotiations, and I just hope that this bottle of words will relate to the realities that we're facing to make it relevant, right? So now with that from Jing, I think what we're looking at now is, because of this target, the commitment, the renewed commitment of states to be ambitious in terms of the conservation targets with the 30 by 30, there was quite a big response also from the donor community, where they expressed support to this target, that yes, indeed, because of climate change and because we need to protect the only planet that we have, they said, we want to contribute to this global effort to protect biodiversity. So a number of donors made commitments, and that was announced in Glasgow in the climate change. And that commitment, particularly the 1.7 billion, is in relation to forest conservation and protection. But nevertheless, more and more donors, philanthropists, and investors are putting money to support conservation. So that is a positive development. The question now is, how will those funds reach those that are actually doing the conservation? The indigenous communities that also needs support so that they can have sustainable livelihoods while they are also protecting biodiversity. So with that introduction for Casey, let me call on Casey to share his insights. Casey is from the Christensen Fund. I mentioned earlier, but for those that were not here in the beginning, the Christensen Fund made a bold decision that they have shifted now to support the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and will be partnering with indigenous organizations and their allies in supporting that implementation. So, and they are part of this pledge for supporting conservation efforts of indigenous communities. So, Casey.
All right, trying to figure out how to work the video here.
On the arrow, you should click on the arrow, you get more.
Yeah, how come?
This one here.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. All right, we did it. Yeah, so I think just quickly, a background on kind of our philosophy at Christensen, and maybe a little bit of my own personal opinion as well. But I think for well over a decade, we've been talking about how 4 to 5% of the world's population is indigenous, and how the lands in which they reside on hold 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And this is no coincidence. We've been saying this stat for over a decade now. And I think it's time that we truly stop viewing indigenous peoples as obstacles and really stop viewing them as chess pieces in the larger conservation and biodiversity protection game. And rather that we start recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples are absolutely critical when advancing the goals of conservation and biodiversity. And so that's why the Christensen Fund, as Joanne said, our mission is solely to uphold the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the way we're doing that is we're giving multi-year direct support directly to indigenous organizations and indigenous governance systems. And we believe that all of those amazing things that indigenous peoples do through their traditional livelihoods, through their governance, will naturally come about. And that's just had Jing hinted to, they will naturally protect the areas in which they live. And as Joanne said at COP26 in Glasgow, there was a historic commitment of $1.7 billion of about 30 different signatories, Christensen Fund being one of them, to essentially support land tenure for indigenous peoples and local communities in tropical forests. Now, while this is a historic announcement, I think it comes with a lot of complications as well. And I think the main question is now is how, when, and even if indigenous peoples will receive any of this funding. And I think that's why the Christensen Fund is trying to champion this process right now. And I think one issue that I'm seeing is constantly, philanthropy and multilaterals need to improve their processes. But philanthropy and governments always talk about how indigenous organizations need to raise their capacity in order to receive our funding. And while I think that's important, I think we need to meet in the middle and find a balance where multilaterals and philanthropy can continue to better their practices and look at how they can, reduce the administrative burden that they're placing on indigenous organizations to receive this funding. So that's one thing that we're mainly focused on right now. And I think as a global community, both multilaterals, governments, and philanthropy alongside indigenous peoples need to work together urgently to create a new standard when supporting indigenous organizations that makes access to funds much easier. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Casey. We hope that this will become the trend, among donors, that finally they will appreciate the contributions of indigenous peoples, but also be more culturally sensitive to meeting the needs of indigenous peoples instead of giving unnecessary burden. Of course, the accountability will always be there, right, as an operating principle, but not to the extent that it becomes cumbersome, that practically communities cannot be able to perform what they actually need to do. But as a follow through, Casey, to that now, because that commitment is more intended for forest, right? Forest protection, clearly. But I see that the trend among also foundations, because there are different rules. I think the bilaterals, comparing that this is more public money, so they have more requirements, bureaucracy. The more flexible ones are the foundations, the philanthropies, and it seems like there's a big pot now of funds coming from the philanthropies. So how can indigenous peoples tap these resources, the ones that are more flexible?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think there's a lot of areas for improvement on that. And I think there's a lot of amazing organizations out there, some indigenous led, who are supporting indigenous communities in a great way. But my biggest concern right now is that both indigenous led funds and local organizations are being overlooked. And I think philanthropy has a space to try and figure out how to raise capacities of local organizations and indigenous led funds to make sure they're not overlooked in kind of this new wave of very large funding going towards indigenous peoples.
Okay, thanks for that. So let's hope that okay, Jean.
Whether wearing my other hat as a member of a found, so wearing my other hat, I look like a duck.
Yeah, you're not wearing your hat, you're wearing your mask.
So just putting on my other hat as also from a foundation that committed to the 1.7 billion pledge, but also the Protecting Our Planet Challenge. I think this is a very important thing, ensuring direct access to Indigenous peoples, ensuring that all of these members of those commitments adhere to a minimum set of principles that commit to safeguard Indigenous peoples and that commit to directly providing funds. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do through our engagement. And maybe just picking up on one of the threads of our conversation, it's also important to be flexible enough to allow Indigenous organizations to be, to support their readiness, like we said,
Yeah.
because sometimes there are funders who just give money and expect good results, good accounting procedures right away. But sometimes you need to build the capacity of Indigenous people. So this is something that we at TERO are doing, trying to make sure that there is ways to prepare the communities, Indigenous peoples themselves, to receive the funds. So we are partnering with others to develop this program so that eventually we can absorb 100 million out of the 1.7 billion or 5.5 billion. But I think this is also very important.
Casey?
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, Jing, I think that's the readiness grants is something that I think is absolutely critical, and where philanthropy is able to take more risks than multilaterals and governments. But I think there needs to be an international call for transparency and accountability when it comes to grant making to Indigenous peoples. I think a lot of foundations out there are black boxes. We all know how hard fundraising is. And I think the Christensen Fund, alongside TERO and others, is interested in meeting at the Permanent Forum to talk about how we can create a simple but basic level of accountability and transparency in our grant making.
Yes. Yeah, there are hands up here, online. Who's the one raising their hands? Whoever is raising the hand from our friends on the virtual.
It's been lowered.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah. Do you want to say anything, Stan, before I open?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, sure. I just want to say something about the accountability processes. So we've just been lucky enough to get a 7-year grant from the government for our ranger program. And part of that funding grant was looking at capacity building and looking at how we can pass some of those funding on to some of the communities to be able to not only employ rangers themselves, but do some of the ranger activities on ground. So we've put a little project together where we actually went out to all the different organisations, Indigenous organisations in Torres Strait. Firstly, we've sent a letter out to all of them, asking them whether they were interested in doing some of that work or helping us to do some of that work. And those ones that came back to us with yes, we then sent out a survey. That survey was looking at their governance structures, their financial mechanisms in there, their workplace health and safety programs, how they do their recruiting, all those sorts of things, which is standard for any grants that come from the government. So all that information came back through those surveys, and of the 12 organisations that wanted to participate, none of them were at the standard that were required to be able to take on government funding to do some of that work. So now we're looking at what capacity do we need to build in some of those organisations? How much is it going to cost to build those functions? So we're currently doing that work now because obviously I'm from Torres Strait, and I would like to see
Yeah.
my own people doing that work.
Yeah.
They're getting funded directly
Yeah.
to do that work. So that's the next step in this process. So I'm hoping that in 3 years' time, we will have built that capacity. And so the last 4 years of our funding, we can actually fund communities directly to work side by side with my rangers as equal partners. So
good, very encouraging to hear that. Yes, so now I open the floor for any questions or some brief comments. So I will call the ones in the room, but the ones online, you can also press the button for the raise hands, or you can ask your comment in the chat box. So I have Saro and Daniel. So we'll get 3 questions, 2 to 3, before I pass on to our panelists. So Saro, if you can be brief, please.
Okay, well, I thank the panelists for their presentation. I'm Saro.
But
Try it. But you mean the others cannot hear him?
I can bring it closer.
I can, okay. No, because we have more virtual participants, so we have to make sure they hear it.
Okay, my first question goes to Jing. You talk about the issue of capacity, which of course is very important in this discussion. I just want to know how you are going about and how to identify people for a soil capacity program, because it's very, very important for the question about conservation and biodiversity. And for Stan, I have 2 questions for you. One, I just want to know how did you get to the point where you're able to build this sort of recognition and partnership between the government and the community? And the second thing is about what drives most of the government conservation program is how to make money out of conservation, tourism and the rest. How is the community benefiting in terms of monetary terms? Is the community benefiting from the sort of model that you are running in your area? And then the third issue goes to Cassie. In this discussion, just like Joanne mentioned, that bilaterals I find it always difficult to provide that sort of thing for. In this commitment among the donor community, as the bilaterals and multilaterals make certain commitment to perhaps make access, not just to indigenous, to other local communities who want to access, because I know that in the JEF, we have been in that sort of struggle to have that sort of direct funding for indigenous people over the year, which has not worked. I know that Climate Environment Fund tried to do the DGM project, which you said they need to go further than that. So I just want to know that sort of commitment. How is that commitment going among the bilaterals?
Okay, that's already quite a set of questions. Okay, Daniel?
Yeah. Thank you for the presenters. I'm Daniel Kobe from Kenya, from Ogiek Peoples. First, let me sympathize with the situation of Ngorongoro and the people of the Loliondo and Ngorongoro of Tanzania. But my question is to Stan about the community protocols. You discussed about this. I don't know whether have you established community protocols to take care of what you are explaining? And then for Jennifer, when we talk about capacity, can we also be careful so that we don't use the word capacity to deny indigenous peoples the chances to do projects? Because I remember in my initial work with the indigenous peoples, whenever I look for, and then they say that organization has no capacity. What is capacity? This should be, well, because some of us have our basic professions where we came from, and we could manage. But somebody coined the word capacity to his own advantage. So I'm also becoming very concerned about. Finally, to my friend Casey, and thanks for coming on board and discussing about the issue of climate and the amount of money, 1.7 billion. I don't know what mechanism have been put in place to ensure actually indigenous people's organization will get this money in a basic language, because when we are here, people are discussing of GF. GF is another big animal, which sometimes is not easy for some of us to get money. And when people discuss here, GF will get money, and I say, how? Because I have personally tried, and maybe the closest I've been is the small grants program. So when we discuss this, I think Christian Fund and those who are pro-indigenous people should really come up with a proper mechanism to see that IPs get the money. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that, Daniel. I think that's I don't see any question in the virtual participants. So we just go ahead with the questions from the room. So any of you who wants to start responding?
Sure, I can start.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for those questions. So I guess first thing I'll start with is that point of recognition that you raised. So what we did in Torres Strait, we've got our own land and sea management strategy, and we created that by doing a significant community consultation process where we went out several times to each community. We had community meetings, getting feedback from the community on what their priorities were for the environment, how they wanted to manage the environment, what they saw as important, what are those, what sort of gates, what's in and what's out, what's in scope, what's out scope. So by consulting with the whole community and then putting together this land and sea strategy that goes out to 2036, which also encompassed a first sort of go that we had of a state of the environment report with values in there, with key indicators, those kind of things. And so we created this land and sea strategy, and then we went back out to the community and got approval from community members to say, yes, we agree with this land and sea strategy. And that was the document that we then took to the government to say, look at this, we've got it all documented. This is our priorities. This is moving forward in our environment. This is how we want to manage our environment right up to 2036. And I must say that every 4 years, we do a review of that strategy as well. So to make sure, and then we have project type plans that sit underneath that strategy as well. The community benefits. So when we go out as a team to go out and do some environmental work, we also get community members to come with us. So we ask for volunteers. Well, we ask for nominations, and they nominate 4 or 5, depending on how big the project is. They nominate 4 or 5 people from that community to come with us, and we pay them. We pay them because they are experts as well. And they're part of our workforce. So we have a budget to pay them to come with us to do the work. We also get, if we go out to do this sort of work, whatever catering and food, we get catering from the community. We pay for the catering from the community, pay for them to make all the catering for us, and accommodation. So if we need to billet people in accommodation in those communities, because they're very small communities, they don't have much accommodation, not like, Geneva. So we actually pay people to stay at their houses as well. So they're the community benefits at the moment. The other benefits, I guess, in terms of, like I said before, it's that being part of the process and understanding how to run meetings and understanding governance processes. They're the, I guess, the non-financial non-financial things, which I think are as just as important.
Yeah.
And for them to have ownership, and for them to come on the journey with us, and for them to feel like they're in charge. They make the decisions. And if a community says to us, no, we don't want you to come, we don't go. It's as simple as that.
Okay, Yanji, and then Casey.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the question on capacity.
Yes. The main way that TERO works is through what we call place-anchored partnerships, or partnerships with those who are committed to safeguard their territories for future generations. So in that way, we strengthen Indigenous guardianship. And the way we choose our place-anchored partners has nothing to do with their capacity to absorb funds. We concentrate on their commitment to manage or to govern their areas well. So they are free to say whether they would like to receive the funds themselves or if they would like a fiscal sponsor. Okay, and in some cases, it's half and half, no? Some opt to receive the funds themselves, some opt to have fiscal sponsors. But once the partnership is in place, they can make requests such as trainings to improve their financial capacity. And what we're talking about is no financial capacity here, not the other capacity building. So I'll focus on that. So we provide trainings upon request, but at the same time, we have these unrestricted grants so that they can identify their priorities. So by themselves, through the unrestricted grants, they could put in their budget, getting someone to come in and train them to be able to absorb the funds. Okay, so that's one approach. But we have another one that's being put in place. So I cannot tell you about the results yet. But in Glasgow, there was a decision about carbon markets, and now there's really this race, for companies to enter into the carbon markets, or even countries. And Indigenous peoples are being targeted. So we feel like it's important for Indigenous peoples, number one, to know what this is, what the carbon market is, so that they can make their own decision on whether to engage or not. And then number two, to make sure that they are ready, they are able to ask the right questions, they have the right technical capacity to be able to access the funds. And then number three, to be able to establish their financial systems so that they can absorb the funds, they can receive more bigger funds, because the bigger the funds are, the more stringent the requirements are in relation to the financial management capacity. So those are our approaches. But what I really wanted to say is that in choosing partners, we don't look at their financial capacity. Yep.
Okay, Casey.
obviously they don't represent all indigenous peoples, and they have large networks, and it's very hard for them to kind of reach out to all of their communities. But one government did say that they would be open in 5 years to looking at creating a new international standard on supporting indigenous peoples, which I think is pretty optimistic. And then to answer your question, Daniel, I think we're looking at, ways on how we can be accountable and transparent on where these grants are going. And I think that's a work in progress. But I think the Christensen Fund, along with a few others, are really working hard to see how they can create the most transparent and accountable process possible, and presenting that to the group and seeing if they'll follow along.
Okay, thanks, Casey and Stan and Jing. We only have 1 minute left.
Okay.
Yeah, but just to circle around in our discussion, I just want to relate back to the challenge that we're facing in Tanzania about the threat for eviction by the. Oh, sorry, am I muted?
Yes.
So, hello.
Now you're not.
So I'm fine now. A while ago, it was echoing. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm just saying is that I just want to circle back to the case of Tanzania and this whole issue of funding, because while this 70,000 Maasai facing threat, not only because there's two, that's practically 150,000 Maasai facing eviction threats in Tanzania. And while we're here discussing about the capacity or whatnot in terms of funding and all these millions of funding, nothing is trickling down to those in need in these Maasai communities wanting to have resources so that they can come together, mobilize themselves, and do their protest actions and protect their territory. So if we try to circle back, this is the situation we're facing in now, right? In terms of conservation, in terms of access to funds. And while we're looking at this as still the reality, there are lessons learned and good examples that we can reflect upon, as presented by Stan in the case of Australia in the Torres Strait Islands. So with the discussion now, or the conversation that's going around in terms of ensuring that indigenous peoples should be at the center of conservation efforts as a key player to this, what I gather, at least the keywords that came out from this discussion, which I hope will resonate in the working groups, in the plenary, in the communities, in the different areas of discussion are this. What indigenous peoples are saying is the respect for rights, respect, equity, and dignity. These are the key elements that should guide us in moving forward with states, with other actors, in ensuring that the 30 by 30 target will be achieved, and in the spirit of partnership and equity. So I think those are what I hope the takeaway from here. And of course, within this is that when we also talk of partnership, it's also partnership that's guided by co-responsibilities, right? That we take on the responsibility to continue to protect our resources, our biodiversity, and others also have to take responsibility in ensuring that our rights are respected and that resources are provided to where it's needed. Thank you. Good day to everyone. And I hope that those that will stay here in the CBD will continue to champion the rights of indigenous peoples. We wish you all the luck. And those struggling on the ground to also keep your ground, and that we are in solidarity with you. Unfortunately, Edward was not able to join, but just to convey to through also Daniel here, a Maasai from Kenya, that our Maasai brothers, that we have our solidarity to all our Maasai brothers and sisters that are standing their ground to protect their land and resources from eviction due to conservation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.